He was called many things: prophet, charlatan, poet, addict, the wickedest man in the world. Aleister Crowley wore infamy like a crown of thorns and never flinched. He invoked demons, mocked God, and named himself the Beast 666. A man whose name dripped from headlines like poison ink. But behind the rituals and the scandals, behind the smoke and the serpents and the sacred posturing, were 3 small lives, 3 daughters. They didn't ask for magic, they didn't call upon spirits, they didn't want to be remembered. And yet, they were his legacy. The only thing Crowley ever created that he couldn't fully control. Lilith, Lola, Zaza. Estarta, born into chaos, raised among ruins. And ultimately, they each walked away, not with a scream, not with vengeance, but with the rarest power of all, silence. This is not their father's story. This is the story of what he left behind, and what they refused to become. If you believe that some legacies are buried, not burned, and that silence can be the most powerful spell of all, subscribe now. Because today, we remember the daughters who undid the beast. Before they could speak, they were surrounded by symbols. Before they could walk, they were watched by gods, ones their father had invented. Aleister Crowley didn't build a home. He built a stage, a sanctuary of scandal, a shrine to his own chaos. The world called him the Beast, but he called it freedom. Freedom from God, from morality, from shame. In temples scrawled with blood and Latin, he summoned spirits, lovers, disciples, and daughters, not fathered, conjured. He named them after goddesses and demons: Lilith, Lola, Zaza, Estarta. Each name, a prophecy he never stayed long enough to explain. He wrote books of magic, but never bedtime stories. He traveled the world, but never followed his children into it. His legacy was printed in scandal, black ink headlines, whispered curses, public rituals. But in the shadows of those ceremonies, small lives waited, forgotten, unseen, unprotected. Because while the world obsessed over the myth of the man, the ones who bore his name were already preparing to bury it. Her name was a spell: Nuith Atha, Hecate Sappho, Jezebel Lilith. Named for night skies, witches, doomed queens, and sacred poets, as if her father believed that if he gave her enough power, the world couldn't touch her. But it did. She was born in 1904, the same year her father claimed to have received divine revelation. The Book of the Law. It was the birth of a religion. And the birth of a daughter. He summoned spirits in Cairo. He lit candles in dark rooms. He proclaimed new gods into being. And somewhere in the house, a baby cried. Lilith lived among manuscripts, incense, and instability. They took her to Loch Ness, then to China, then to India, then to Burma. She never had a crib, just corners of temples. She never had lullabies, just invocations echoing through the walls. And then, at just 1 year old, she fell ill in Rangoon. Typhoid, no clean water, no hospital, no miracle. Lilith died in 1906, the firstborn daughter of the Beast, gone before she could speak. Crowley wasn't there. He was off chasing mountains, symbols, visions. He came back to find a coffin and silence. He blamed her mother, called her a drunk, called it negligence. But the truth? He never learned how to stay. Lilith's death was more than tragedy. It was the first crack in the myth. A flame snuffed out, and no ritual could bring her back. No poems, no spells. Just grief, just absence. The daughter with the longest name is the one the world forgot first. She died in Rangoon. But the real collapse began when they returned. Lilith was gone, but so was everything else. The man who called himself the Beast stood in a nursery that would never be used again. No rituals, no incense, just a silence too heavy to carry. He blamed Rose, said she drank too much, said she wasn't watching. But he wasn't watching either. He was climbing mountains, chasing visions, trying to become more than human, and forgetting how to be a father. Rose shattered in slow motion. No more Cairo, no more gods, only wine bottles, opium, and wandering thoughts. She drank to forget. He travelled to forget. But Lilith never left the room. She hovered between them, between sentences, between what they could have been and what they had become. By 1909, it was over. He filed for divorce and took the blame himself. Adultery. But adultery was just the symptom. Grief was the disease, and Lilith was the ghost they couldn't banish. Crowley would summon many things: spirits, sex, fame, fire, fear. But he could never summon her again. Not the little girl with the impossible name, not the laughter that had barely begun, not the love that might have changed him if he'd stayed. Some legacies begin with greatness. This one began with loss, and from that moment on, every daughter would carry the weight of the one who never had a chance. She arrived in February 1907. Just months after Lilith's coffin was closed. No gods were summoned this time, no prophecies, no rituals. Just a baby girl, born into a house made of grief. Her name was simpler, Lola Zaza. No cosmic burden, just syllables her mother could whisper without weeping. But love wasn't waiting for her, just a broken father, and a mother falling apart by the hour. Crowley's marriage was done before Lola could walk. Rose was drinking. Crowley was drifting. There was no nursery built for her, no bedtime stories. Only echoes of a daughter no one could speak of, and a man who refused to stay. By 1909, the marriage ended. Crowley walked away, citing his own adultery. He didn't ask for custody, didn't fight for visitation, didn't write letters in the night. He left. Rose couldn't care for Lola, so her brother stepped in, Gerald Kelly, a man of manners, oil paints, and order. And Lola was quietly removed from the chaos, raised in London, far from the rituals, far from the whispers, far from the father whose shadow she refused to stand under. She didn't run from Crowley. She just walked in the other direction. And when the world asked who she was, she chose a new answer. Lola didn't burn the bridge. She buried it. She never stood on a podium, never gave an interview, never once said the name Crowley on record. Because Lola didn't want to explain her father. She wanted to outlive him. She was raised in a household that prized silence over scandal, where afternoon tea replaced incense, where paintings replaced pentagrams, where children weren't symbols, they were simply children. And when Lola came of age, she made her final cut. She married a man named Frank Hill, took his last name, and never looked back. From that day forward, she wasn't Lola Zaza Crowley. She was Mrs. Lola Hill, nursery governess, mother, ordinary citizen of an ordinary England. No symbols carved into the walls, no whispered invocations, no interviews with curious scholars. Just quiet, just a small home, just a child of her own, named Elizabeth. And if Crowley ever tried to reach her, he was met with silence, because she didn't need confrontation. She didn't need revenge. She just needed a different story. And she wrote it, one unremarkable, beautiful day at a time. Lola Hill lived to be 83. By the time she passed in 1990, no one remembered she was the daughter of the most infamous occultist in modern history. That was the point. She wasn't running from shame, she was running toward normal, and she reached it. Because sometimes the boldest rebellion is a quiet name, a peaceful home, and a life that says nothing at all. There was no trial, no press conference, no renunciation. Just the quiet act of non-participation. Lola never argued with her father's image. She never tried to correct it. She simply refused to carry it. She didn't burn his books. She didn't defend them either. She didn't speak his name because in her world, he didn't exist. No biographers were called, no archives opened, no publishers approached with the secret story of the beast's daughter. Lola's truth wasn't hidden, it was closed. And the world, so obsessed with Crowley's darkness, forgot to ask where his children went. Even her gravestone said nothing of him, no hint of the chaos she was born into, no trace of the man she erased with stillness. She raised her daughter without talismans, without relics, without stories, because there was no need to pass it down. Some names don't deserve to echo. Lola Hill died not as a symbol, not as a daughter of scandal, but as a woman who reclaimed her bloodline in silence. She didn't have to destroy her father's legacy. She simply refused to keep it alive. And in doing so, she broke the spell no one else dared touch. She was born under a different sky, not in a nursery, in a commune, not in mourning, but in madness. Estarta Lulu Panthea Crowley, named like a prophecy, worshipped like a symbol, held not as a daughter, but as another page in his book of the law. The year was 1920. The place, the Abbey of Thelema in Cefalù, Sicily, a sun-scorched cult compound where magic replaced medicine and rituals replaced responsibility. Her mother was Nanette Shumway, an American seeker, widowed, wandering, and pulled into Crowley's orbit like so many others before her. She became one of his lovers, one of his initiates, and in that chaos, Estarta was born, raised among painted demons on the walls, among screams mistaken for prayer, among lovers, gods, and ghosts. She didn't cry to lullabies, she cried to chants in languages no child should hear. She wasn't wrapped in blankets, she was wrapped in symbols. Even before she could walk, tragedy returned. Another infant at the Abbey, Pupai, died. Crowley grew paranoid, accused Nanette of sorcery, banished her while she was still pregnant. Madness was no longer poetic, it was dangerous. But somehow Estarta survived, because her mother stepped away, just far enough to protect the one thing the Abbey couldn't claim, a future. By 1923, the Abbey of Thelema was rotting from the inside. The rituals had become reckless, the lovers broken, the followers starved, drugged, lost. The walls were covered in blood-soaked murals. Devotion had turned to delusion. Crowley's vision was no longer spiritual, it was toxic. One follower died after drinking cat's blood. Another miscarried in the hallway. The Italian press called it a cult. Mussolini called it a threat. The government acted. The beast was exiled. The Abbey was shut down. Doors boarded, magic silenced. And just like that, the empire fell. Crowley left. The disciples scattered, and Nanette Shumway took her toddler daughter and vanished. She didn't scream. She didn't write a memoir. She simply left. Took Estarta with her, back across the ocean, back to America. No ritual, no procession, no spell. Just a mother and a daughter walking out of a world that should have never tried to raise a child. Crowley continued elsewhere, new countries, new disciples. But Estarta's chapter in his book was already closed. He wouldn't raise her, he wouldn't find her, he wouldn't be mentioned at her school. She was no longer Estarta. She was becoming Louise. And for the first time in Crowley's twisted lineage, a daughter was about to find safety before the damage could reach her. She was born Estarta Lulu Panthea Crowley, a name fit for temples, scripts, prophecy. But America had no use for such names, and neither did she. She became Louise Shumway, then Louise Mueller after marriage, a woman no one whispered about, because there was nothing to whisper. There were no altars, only church pews, no incense, just Sunday light through stained glass. Louise became a Presbyterian, a mother, a schoolteacher, A woman who spent 50 years guiding children through spelling and arithmetic, not magic and madness. She lived in California, tended a garden, wrote lesson plans, held her grandchildren. Not once did she claim the name Crowley, not in interviews, not on paper, not even among neighbors who'd ask about her past. She wasn't hiding, she had simply replaced it. There were no shrines, only family photos, no rituals, only routines. Her father died addicted, alone, half mad in 1947. She didn't attend the funeral, didn't send flowers, didn't speak his name. Because Louise didn't live in rebellion. She lived in correction. She didn't flee the legacy. She rewrote the ending. The child of Thelema became a beacon of peace, and no one saw it, because she never needed to be seen. She lived in Oakland, California, drove to the grocery store, watered the garden, held her great-grandchildren on her lap. Her name was Louise Muller. Her smile was soft, her voice quiet. She volunteered at church, made casseroles for funerals, graded homework at the kitchen table. No one ever asked her about her father, because no one ever guessed. She had no trace of him, no books, no relics, no hidden bookshelf of forbidden texts. She wasn't a secret. She was simply ordinary, and beautifully so. But history has a way of circling back. Late in life, whispers returned. Genealogists, researchers, curious eyes. Some pieced it together. Estarta, Shumway, Crowley. The last daughter of the beast had been living down the street all along. But Louise never confirmed it, never gave interviews, never wrote memoirs. She didn't want to be the daughter of Aleister Crowley. She wanted to be a woman who left something better behind. She passed away in 2014 at the age of 93, not in infamy, not in shame, but in peace. Her obituary didn't mention him, neither did her gravestone, because the most powerful legacy she left was the one she refused to inherit. There was no pact between them, no reunion, no circle of sisters plotting revenge. They never marched against the myth. They never needed to, because the silence of 3 daughters can be louder than any ritual ever spoken. Lilith, who never had the chance to run, who became a ghost before she could speak. Lola, who erased the name, who became a mother, a governess, a woman with no interest in the spotlight her father courted. And Louise, who transformed from temple child to classroom teacher, who never told the world who she truly was, because she didn't need the world to know. None of them joined his path. None of them followed his teachings. None of them wrote defenses or apologies or desperate attempts to preserve the flame. They let the fire go out, gently, without anger, without spectacle. Each, in her own way, stood at the edge of the legacy and turned away, not out of shame, not out of rebellion, but because they knew not every inheritance deserves to be carried. They didn't destroy his work. They simply declined the invitation to live inside it. And in doing so, they did what the world never could. They ended Aleister Crowley, not with violence, not with exposure, with dignity. They shared his blood, but none of them shared his belief. Not in power, not in prophecy, not in the idea that the world owed them meaning. Lilith never lived long enough to choose, but Lola and Louise did. And they chose not to become footnotes in his mythology, but whole stories of their own. They could have spoken. They could have cashed in. They didn't. Because inheritance isn't what you're born with. It's what you're willing to carry. And they carried nothing. No symbols, no shame, no need to explain who he was. Because they knew exactly who they weren't. And that was enough. They weren't afraid. They weren't hiding. They were choosing not to explain, not to defend, not to drag pain into the light just to prove it was real. The world expected memoirs, expected outrage, expected a reckoning, What it got instead was a closed door and a life well lived. Because sometimes silence isn't secrecy, it's survival. And dignity doesn't beg to be seen. It walks away, calm, quiet, whole. He died in 1947, addicted, penniless, surrounded not by family, but by followers who were already drifting away. There was no final ritual, no redemption. No voice calling him father. The man who once claimed to summon gods was buried like any other man, quietly, with no daughters by his side. Not one came, not one wept publicly, not one turned his funeral into legacy. He passed into the dark, and they stayed in the light. That was the final divide. Crowley believed in power through ritual, in control through names, symbols, fear. But his daughters taught a deeper truth. You don't have to break a curse. You can just live beyond it. Lola rewrote it with motherhood, Louise with education, Lilith with silence that echoed longer than her life. They didn't wage war against his shadow. They walked past it, and in doing so, they cast a new kind of spell, one he never saw coming: peace. They could have spoken. They could have inherited the myth. They could have turned his shadow into a spotlight. But they didn't. They chose peace over power, distance over drama, stillness over spectacle. No foundations, no documentaries, no rewritten truths. Just lives, soft, strong, untethered from the storm that made them. Aleister Crowley left rituals. His daughters left nothing behind. And in doing so, they left everything that matters. If you believe that silence can be sacred, that legacy can end with grace, and that not all names are worth keeping, subscribe now to honor the story they never told and the lives they lived instead.